standing tall. We want a free and prosperous Alberta. Good. Leighton Grey. I'm not sure all that. Still going forward. Okay.
I'm not going to be able to take my sunglasses off. I won't be able to see. Did you tell everybody how they got to get up here? Oh, this is going to be short. Okay. Doesn't matter which one. This is silly. I feel bad. Are you going to be able to get up here? Okay. All right. Good afternoon, Wetaskiwin. I see all the little kids having a good time over there in the Bouncy Castle. I'll be there right away to play. Welcome to an afternoon of Solutions for a New Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project, a group of grassroots Albertans with no politicians at our table, committed to advocating, inspiring, and educating all Albertans on the merits of a free and prosperous nation. The Alberta Prosperity Project came from humble beginnings in an oil field shop in Nisku, Alberta, just about a year ago. A group of like-minded Albertans who had had enough of top-down, corrupt, tyrannical government meddling in their affairs decided to do something about it. And from that humble beginning, the Alberta Prosperity Project was born, and here we are. I'd like to invite Pam Koenig to open our event with a prayer.
Because we believe in the sovereignty of God, we'd just like to take a moment to give him our thanks. Please bow your head with me. Our Father who art in heaven, we just thank you for who you are today. We thank you for the beautiful day that you have given us. Even though it's a little windy, we still appreciate everything that you do for us each and every day. I ask that you be with this team today. Give us the courage and the words to say that we need to. We thank you for Albertans. We thank you for Alberta. And we pray all these things in your precious name. Amen.
Thank you, Pam. My name's Shannon Packham, and I'm from Patricia, Alberta. I was a teacher, but I decided that the things that were going on in schools was probably not for me. And it was then that I realized that if you are not willing to stand up for what is right, then you have to also understand that you are part of what is wrong. I think it's time that all Albertans dig deep and try to start making things right. Thomas Jefferson once said, whenever you do a thing, do it as if the whole world is watching. The Alberta Prosperity Project has suggestions for our province that will indeed have the whole world watching. Alberta will be able to grow, to prove to the world that it is indeed possible to operate and succeed as a sovereign nation, one that will be the envy of the world. You're skeptical. We know that. That's why we're here. We hope that your presence here encourages you and helps you to understand the potential that we have, and that it empowers you to share this fantastic message with your family and friends. So with that, I'm going to just get started with our first guest. Our first guest is an independent researcher and a writer. He is a columnist for the Western Standard. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors and a Master of Arts degree in political science from the University of Calgary. He obtained his PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. His book, Alberta, Separatism Then and Now, accounts how federal government's policies have been designed to exploit the West, Alberta in particular. Most recently, he has strongly been advocating for Alberta independence. He boldly thrusts this argument for independent Alberta into the limelight with another of his published works, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. He and his wife Ivy have 11 children, and they have been homeschooling for 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, shedding some light on our independence journey is Dr. Michael Wagner.
Just my hand. Thank you for that introduction, Shannon. We're just going to put another stool here for my papers because we don't have a podium. So I actually have one of my kids waiting to grab papers that blow away. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about why Alberta needs to become independent. Thank you. Now, I need to explain this from a historical perspective. We need to understand history. We need to understand Alberta's history and the history of the West to properly understand why Alberta needs to become independent. I mean, Alberta and many Westerners have felt neglected by Canada for generations. And this sentiment of feeling neglected and exploited has been building for over many years to the point where now many Albertans are considering Alberta independence as a real option. So the West has long felt unfairly treated within Canada. This part of Canada used to be what's called Rupert's Land, which was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And it was purchased by Canada and annexed to Canada without any of the people that were living here at the time being consulted. When you remember back to the 1800s, there was a settlement at Red River, what's now Manitoba. There were thousands of people there, and they were purchased by Canada and added to Canada without being consulted. And there were people there who had different ideas about what their political future should be. And that's one of the reasons why the first real rebellion occurred in 1870, as some of the people there were unhappy about being annexed to Canada without being consulted. Now, after this became part of Canada, Canada brought in settlers to create an agricultural economy in Western Canada. And the farmers here, pardon me? Sure. So, sorry about these difficulties, just the wind blowing on. I just need page 2. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, well, actually, I should be able to handle this for you. Sorry for, do not adjust your set. These are just temporary technical problems. Settlers were brought in here to create an agricultural economy, and the farmers that came here that started developing the area had two particular disadvantages. For the one part, on the one hand, there were protective tariffs so that the farmers were in a sense forced to buy their farming equipment from central Canada. So it ended up paying higher prices for the farming equipment because they had to buy it from central Canada. Then when they sold their grain, they had to sell it through middlemen, and the middlemen would take part of the price that they should get. They also had to pay the transportation costs. So the farmers here had to pay more for the equipment, and they received less for their product than they would otherwise. Now, the farmers that did live here, the people that lived out west, they didn't just sit back and take that. They fought back politically. For one thing, they turned away from Canada's mainstream parties. They formed new parties that would represent their interests rather than representing central Canada. One of the parties at the provincial level here in Alberta was United Farmers of Alberta. So from 1921 to 1935, Alberta had a government, provincial government of United Farmers of Alberta, an alternative party to the mainstream parties. Also at the federal level, most Albertans in the 1920s supported the Progressive Party. Now, progressive in those days meant something different than it does today, but these were ways in which Albertans fought back against the inequalities that they felt they had within Canada. But despite all of these, despite all of this fighting back, they didn't reach the point yet where they considered independence. Now, one of the most unique parties that was developed in in Alberta was the Social Credit Party, and the Social Credit Party was elected as a provincial government in 1935. It was international news because it was something that was so distinct to Alberta, something that wasn't happening anywhere else. The founder of Alberta Report magazine, Ted Byfield, he wrote this about Alberta electing a social credit government in 1935. He said this: "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." So Albertans were willing to fight back in those days, but yet without reaching the point of wanting independence. That all changed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in the late 1960s. Because of Pierre Trudeau becoming Prime Minister, some Westerners for the first time began to seriously consider independence. Pierre Trudeau had become Prime Minister in part because one of the things he wanted to achieve was he wanted to make Quebec feel more comfortable within the whole country. He wanted Quebecers to feel more comfortable in Canada, and he wanted to make French more prominent within Canada. And so one of his first laws that he brought in was the Official Languages Act. Some Westerners felt that having so much more French in this part of the country was basically having French pushed down their throats. So as a result, as I mentioned, people in Alberta and in the West started to think about independence as an option. And the first book about Western independence was written in 1971. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays. And most of the essays actually were not in favor of independence, but they did raise the issue for the first time. What was most important, though, about the book was the editors of this book were John Barr and Owen Anderson. John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's education minister at the time, and Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta Premier Harry Strom. So these were influential people in the Alberta government who were beginning to talk for the first time about independence. Now, none of the essays came out explicitly in favor of independence, but John Barr did write about the possibility of independence. Okay. John Barr's argument was this, that Westerners in particular should try and reform Canada. And if we couldn't reform Canada in a way that makes it more beneficial to Alberta, then Alberta should become independent. So this very idea that you even still hear today, that first we'll try to reform Canada before we consider independence, that idea has been around for over 50 years and people have been talking about it for over 50 years. Now, that was in 1971 when that book came out, but the real impetus for independence sentiment began in 1973 with the energy crisis. There was a war in the Middle East and the price of oil skyrocketed. So here, for the first time, Alberta could really cash in on its oil resources by getting these high prices for oil. But our Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, he was not in favor of Alberta getting all of the money for its resources. So he did two particular things. On the one hand, he made sure that oil sold within Canada would be sold at much lower than the market rate. So Alberta would not get the full value of its money for the full value of the price of oil for that if it was sold within Canada. But also Alberta sold a lot of oil to the United States. And so Pierre Trudeau put an export tax on oil to the United States from Alberta. So whether Alberta sold oil within Canada or exported it to the United States, it did not get the full value of its resources that it was owed to it. A lot of that money went to the federal government and to central Canada. Because of that, our premier at the time, Peter Lougheed, he fought strongly for Alberta against Pierre Trudeau throughout the 1970s, and many Albertans supported Peter Lougheed was our premier, and many Albertans supported Peter Lougheed in his fight with Pierre Trudeau over Alberta's oil resources. Then in 1979, there was a federal election, and Joe Clark was elected as Prime Minister. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. He was from Alberta, but he got a minority government. And so his government did not last very long. It fell after just a few months. And there was a federal election in 1980 where Pierre Trudeau was once again running for Prime Minister. Now, what was very significant about this 1980 federal election is that Pierre Trudeau decided to exploit regional differences in order to win the election. In any large country like Canada, there are regions with different interests, and national leaders normally try to play down the differences, try to smooth over the differences in the interest of creating and enhancing national unity. But instead of promoting national unity, Pierre Trudeau decided to exploit the regional differences, as I mentioned, to campaign against Alberta and tell Central Canada that if he was re-elected, he could put Alberta in its place, and Central Canada would benefit from Alberta's resources. So that was kind of the Liberal campaign theme of 1980, or as one Liberal campaign official put it, screw the West, we'll take the rest. That was a kind of a summary of the Liberal election campaign. Of course, Pierre Trudeau was re-elected in that February 1980 federal election, and many Albertans were very upset about that. Shortly after being re-elected, a few months later, Pierre Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program, which was essentially a federal program to take over, for the federal government to take over more of Alberta's oil industry, to take over Alberta's, to have more influence in Alberta's energy sector, even though the Constitution gives ownership and control of natural resources to the provinces. This would allow, the National Energy Program would give the federal government more control over Alberta's energy. That, of course, created the most significant impetus ever for support for Alberta's separation. And what's really interesting is, in this sense, Pierre Trudeau changed Alberta's political culture permanently. Before 1980, before he was re-elected and before the National Energy Program, whenever surveys were done on support for Alberta independence, the supporting numbers were only in the single digits. It would be like 4 or 5 or 6% of people would support Alberta independence. But after 1980, whenever polling is done on support for Alberta independence, it's always double-digit support. The lowest ones I've seen would be like 15 or 16% support, but generally it's usually 20 or 25% or more. So Pierre Trudeau created a permanent change in Alberta's political culture in terms of increasing support for Alberta separation. And so I refer to Pierre Trudeau as the father of the Alberta separation movement, or the father of the Alberta independence movement. So because of the support for independence in Alberta, a political party called the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta ran a candidate in a by-election in 1982, and their candidate was elected in the Old Didsbury constituency. That was the first time that a Western separatist candidate had ever been elected. And that was because of this opposition to Pierre Trudeau and the National Energy Program. Despite the fact that there was this surging support for separation, there were still many people in Alberta who thought that Canada should be given a second chance. One of those people was Senator Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning had been premier from 1943 to 1968. He was our longest-serving premier. And after resigning as premier, he was appointed to the Senate. With two prominent colleagues, he wrote a book in 1981 called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. Now, this book argued that in order for the West to be properly represented within the national government, Canada's national institutions would need to be reformed. And in particular, they proposed Senate reform. By reforming the Senate and other national institutions, the West's interests could properly be represented within the national government. And they said if that kind of institutional reform did not take place, then many people in the West would continue to support the idea of Western independence. And that would become more likely that Western independence would occur if the national institutions were not reformed. So again, as I mentioned, they were proposing Senate reform as a way of getting Alberta's interests represented in the national government. Now, Pierre Trudeau resigned in 1984. He was replaced by John Turner as Prime Minister. Then a few months later, there was a federal election, and Brian Mulroney, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, was elected. So the Liberals were gone, and every Alberta MP was with the Progressive Conservative Party, was part of Mulroney's government. So many Albertans believe, well, we've got rid of Trudeau, we got rid of the Liberals, now our own people, the Progressive Conservatives under Brian Mulroney in power, so now the West will be properly represented and we can not have to worry about this anymore. But it didn't take long for Westerners to realize that even Brian Mulroney would not be able to represent our interests. Because in 1986, the federal government had to get a maintenance contract for Canada's new CF-18 fighter jets. So those CF-18 fighter jets had to be maintained by a particular company that had the specialization to maintain them. And there was only 2 cities in Canada that could compete for that maintenance contract. There was a company in Winnipeg that could do it, and there was a company in Montreal that could do it. So the federal government had this competition, and by the federal government's own criteria, the company in Winnipeg was the best company to maintain the CF-18 fighter jets. So Brian Mulroney's government awarded that contract to the company in Montreal instead, even though Winnipeg had won the contract. So this once again made many Westerners really upset with the federal government. And it shows that we cannot trust even a government of the Conservative Party to represent our interests in every instance. I mean, having a Conservative government in Ottawa is better for Alberta every time because they're not as hard on us as the Liberals. So when the Conservatives are in power, they kind of give us a reprieve, but they're not a permanent solution to the problem, because even a Conservative government that's good to Alberta will only be in there temporarily and will eventually be replaced by another Liberal government. So the Conservatives can give us a reprieve, but they can't give us a permanent solution to Alberta's situation within Canada. So basically, the Conservative Party only can offer a band-aid solution to our problems. Now, what happened in the wake of the CF-18 fighter contract was that a new political party was created in Western Canada, the Reform Party of Canada. Many Westerners wanted a change now. They could tell that the Liberals, neither Liberals nor the Conservatives would give us a good deal. We needed a new political party. And the slogan of the Reform Party was "The West wants in," because the West wanted to be represented in the national interests, or in the national institutions, sorry. Now, one of the documents that was created at this time, I've got a pamphlet here. It's a photocopy of a pamphlet called "A New Federal Political Party to Represent the West." This political pamphlet was created by the Reform Association of Canada. It's a precursor to the Reform Party. And if I can open it up here, hopefully without the wind blowing it away, I just wanted to read some sentences here. So this pamphlet is from 1987. That's 35 years ago. And it says this: "Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West." So it's saying that Ontario and Quebec dominate Canada's national political scene at the expense of the West. "Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change." So that was written in 1987. That's 35 years ago. And you could write the exact same thing today, because nothing has changed in 35 years. So the Reform Party was just getting off the ground. It's 1987. Also in 1988, a book by a federal Conservative member of Parliament named David Kilgour. He wrote a book on Western alienation. It was called Uneasy Patriots. Did I lose that page already? Oh, no, sorry. I got it. It's okay. Anyway, he was in 1988. He wrote that the time had come for Canada to be reformed in a way that would be beneficial to Alberta. And it did seem like the time had come in 1988, because the Reform Party was on the rise. And of course, the Reform Party got significant support in Alberta and Western Canada. Most of our members of Parliament in the 1993 and 1997 elections were Reform Party members of Parliament, because the West wanted in, just as the Reform Party said. But eventually the Reform Party began to lose a little bit of interest in the Western issues. It became more interested in achieving national power. And so it changed itself into the Canadian Alliance in 2000. And then in 2003, it joined with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the Conservative Party of Canada. It eventually won an election it became Stephen Harper was the leader of the Conservative Party, and in 2006 he became Prime Minister. And many Albertans were not concerned then about Alberta's place within Canada, because Stephen Harper was one of the founders of the Reform Party. He was also a member of Parliament from Calgary, so he was safe to represent Alberta's interests within the federal government. So during the time of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, there was very little support for Western independence, because we had our man in Ottawa and we could trust him. Of course, that all changed in 2015 when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, the new Liberal Prime Minister, and Trudeau immediately brought in new policies that were harmful to Alberta's oil industry. He brought in Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which many of its critics called the No More Pipelines Bill, because it made the creation of pipelines so much more difficult. So Alberta would not be able to get pipelines created that would transport our oil for export. Trudeau also brought in Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which some people called the Alberta Tanker Ban, because it prevents Alberta from being able to export its oil off of the West Coast. Of course, Trudeau also brought in the carbon tax, which was challenged in court by the Alberta government, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Trudeau's carbon tax. So these kinds of policies, the No More Pipelines Bill, the tanker ban, the carbon tax, they kind of circumvent Alberta's ownership of its natural resources. As I mentioned, the Constitution guarantees that the provinces own and control their natural resources. But with these kinds of policies that Trudeau has brought in, he circumvents the constitutional protection for the provinces. So that Alberta, so Alberta is losing control of many of its resources indirectly. Stop, please. Sorry, excuse me. Despite the fact that they're trying to shut down our oil industry, nevertheless, they're still taking billions of dollars every year from us that we generate from the oil industry. So on the one hand, they're trying to shut down the oil industry, and on the other hand, they're still taking billions of dollars from that every year. And there's a University of Calgary economist named Robert Mansell who's been studying these issues for many years, and he did a study and concluded that from 1965 until 2018, Alberta had made a net contribution of $630 billion to the federal government. These kinds of things that I've been talking about, this history, is all the bad news, and yet there is good news to report as well. Because of Quebec's independence referendums, and especially after the 1995 referendum, which almost passed in favor of independence in Quebec, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court. It asked the Supreme Court for a ruling on Canada's constitutional law, whether Quebec could declare unilateral independence from Canada. So they asked that specific question of the Supreme Court. And in 1998, the Supreme Court ruled in what's called the secession reference case that Quebec could not unilaterally declare its independence from Canada. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority of people voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate Quebec's independence. So this particular court ruling was done with reference to Quebec, but it applies to every province, so that any province in Canada that holds a referendum on independence with a clear question, if a clear majority of people vote in favor of independence, then that province can become independent. So this would be a way for Alberta to move forward as well with independence. Now, this is kind of unique to Canada. Not every country allows a section of the country to become independent. You might remember Catalonia in Spain a few years ago held an independence referendum, and it passed, but the leaders of the referendum were arrested and put in jail, and Catalonia was not allowed to become independent. And that's because Spain's constitution does not allow any region to become independent. It forbids it. So Canada's constitutional law is different from that in the sense that Canada's constitutional law allows a province to move forward and become independent. Excuse me for a minute here. Anyway, all of this is to say that Alberta's only path forward is to become independent. And we can learn, this is a lesson that we can learn from history. I talked about John Barr writing in 1971 that Alberta should first try and reform Canada and pursue independence if it can't reform Canada. But I mentioned in 1981, Senator Ernest Manning mentioned that, or wrote a book explaining that Canada's national institutions need to be reformed so that the West's interests would be represented. And if Canada's institutions weren't reformed, then the West might consider independence. Then, of course, I mentioned David Kilgour in 1988. He wrote that the time had come for Canada to be reformed in order for the West to for the West to be represented equally within Canada. And then, of course, most of all, there was the Reform Party, which was elected on the platform of getting the West into Canada. When we look at all these things, we can look back and see that the lesson of the Reform Party is that despite all the efforts that we've tried to reform Canada, that Canada cannot be reformed. The people who wrote in the past about these things, they could not know that Canada could not be reformed from their historical vantage point. But our historical vantage point is that we can look back and see what others have done, and we can see that it's no longer possible for Canada to be reformed, or never was possible in the first place. You know, the Reform Party, they did not fail us. The Reform Party did not fail us. Canada failed us. We sent those people to get those reforms, and they were not done. So the West has tried to reform Canada, and Canada does not want to get reformed. If we keep asking Central Canada to be reformed, for reforms to make things beneficial for us, they just keep laughing at us. There's nothing we can do. It doesn't matter what we ask them for, what kind of changes we ask for. They could just keep laughing at us because there's nothing we can do. But if we hold a referendum and we vote in favor of independence, they won't be laughing at us anymore. We'll actually get something done. So just to conclude, I think that Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about and become an independent country. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. So this is kind of the first foray we've had out here in the wind, or in the elements, I suppose, so we'll just do our best. I just forgot to mention that if you find that you need clarification on anything that any of the speakers have touched on, we have index cards at the back or recipe cards. If you want to write your questions down, we've set some time aside for questions a little later on. Our next guest is the founder of a digital education business and curriculum designer and facilitator. After decades as an information technology professional, he has facilitated learning for teens and adults on many topics. He has a passion for helping people realize their potential. He became involved with the Alberta independence movement after concluding that the Canadian Federation is broken and that sovereignty is the best and only option for Albertans. He is married and has 5 children. I was actually talking to his wife the other day, and she told me that she married him for his money. And after 37 years, she's staying around until she finds it. He is also the VP Technology for the Alberta Prosperity Project, and he does so very many things for us at the Alberta Prosperity Project. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Alain Gauthier.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shannon. Talking about someone that does a lot for us. There's a lady here that's filling the blanks everywhere. Anytime we need some help with something, she steps right in. Well, I moved to, my accent is probably recognizable. I moved to Alberta in 1980. At the time after the military, I joined IBM. I became an engineer with them, and I moved to Alberta for 6 months. And well, there you go. Quite a while back. I'm still here. I was told before I moved here, watch out for those Westerners. You know, these stories about the tar and feather, they still do that. First thing you do when you moved, I moved in September. My motorcycle was on a, sorry, I'll talk louder. My motorcycle was coming behind me on a train, and they told me as soon as you get to Edmonton, change the license plate because the Quebec plate will get you pushed off the road. So I'm expecting the worst. But no, what did I find? I found welcome. I found people that were so generous. And I also discovered that, you know, I grew up in a political family. We were involved with the separation movement. My parents were very involved. I was involved myself. I was a union steward, and met Mr. Levesque 3 or 4 times at events much bigger than this one. And really involved, and in our family it wasn't an option. You either got involved in politics or just get out of the way. But when I came here, I stopped after the referendum. Like many French Canadian, we just kind of got disgusted with the rest of our compadres in Quebec. I left. I came here, didn't want to hear about politics, moved on. But I found that people here were a lot more welcomer than I had expected. So that's a good thing. And today, for those of you that are firearms owner or shooters, sports shooters, today is Canada Gun Range Day. So a lot of gun range are open to the public, non-members to participate in sports shooting. So I thought I'd talk about our firearm rights that are being attacked all the time. But then I thought the firearm rights are just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the rights that we've lost, that have eroded over the last 30, 40 years. It's just like you've heard Michael, you'll hear Leighton after me, and you'll hear other speakers talk about, even Katherine, which talks about our justice system has been killed. And so the federal government, as what Michael referred to, not just the Liberals, the Conservative government as well, they've just sat on the sideline, look like. Either they completely don't know what they're doing, which I believe that, but they just kept eroding our rights, and a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, and now we're finding ourselves like with mandates and pastors being jailed more at a higher rate than any other Western country in the world. For peaceful gathering. So it's a nonsense. How did we get there? Well, we got there by just sitting there, by just letting it happen. I am sorry if that offends you, but you know, you sat there and you voted them back in, and you kept voting. I did that too. I didn't miss an election by voting. Well, we keep voting those imbeciles in, and then you just keep taking away our rights. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we need leverage. And as much as you may not like Quebec, they got leverage. How did they get leverage? Well, part of it is the way our system is built. They got more votes, and anybody that's going to try to get elected in Ottawa is going to have to kiss the butt of Ontario and Quebec. So they got leverage there. But they also got leverage because of the referendum. When the referendum started to show up, like in the late 70s, when they started to talk about it more seriously, leading up to the 1980, the federal government actually started to pay attention. They realized how much there was to lose if this province left. And then here we are in Alberta, having $2 out of every $3 that goes out in transfer to go to Quebec. And we sit there and we keep re-electing those guys. It's just unbelievable. So how do we get leverage? And they'll talk about that too. And you can go onto our website and find out more details on that. Well, we'll get leverage with Ottawa with the referendum for independence. Now, whether you're for separation or not, that's not really the question. My point of view here is that ask the people. That's democracy. Get our provincial government in 2023, elect an MLA that's going to support asking the people. Now, if the people say no, fine. But I guarantee you that a lot more people than you may think will vote for independence. Now, then there's a process after that, and there could be sovereignty within Canada, sovereignty outside of Canada. That's really not what concerns me right now. It's just the fact that politics is not a spectator sport. So we got to get on and we got to get involved. And it's not just getting involved by going to the poll every 4 years. Get involved. And I don't care what political party you support. I really don't. It doesn't matter. Support an MLA or an MP that's going to actually work for you as a citizen of Alberta. And then support them outside of just the poll. Get involved. Get involved with the Independence Party, whichever party you want. Get involved. Get involved at the local level, like at a school board, at the city councils, and then become a participant in the political world. That's all we can do, and that's the only way we can get to change this province, change what's happening to us. So that's all I have to say for today, and I thank you very much, and I invite you to visit our website. There's a lot more information there. Thank you very much.
That one's broken. Our next speaker is an exceptional leader. She has been practicing family law in Calgary for over 20 years. Oh boy. She is a fearless defender of the rights and freedoms of Albertans, and we are honored to have her with us today. I'm honored to have met her and to be able to call her my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking to us today about fighting to protect your rights, please welcome Katherine Kowalchuk, Lawyers for Truth. Good afternoon, everybody. So nice to be here. Thank you, Shannon, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everybody in Facebook land for tuning in to watch. It's been a couple of months since I've been speaking with APP, and that's mostly due to the fact that I've moved to the lovely village of Standard, Alberta from Calgary, and have been busy doing other things. However, I still remain committed to the APP, and I also remain committed to an independent Alberta. Most of what I've been talking about since about November with the APP has been about why I believe the court system is not going to be the avenue that Albertans and Canadians can rely upon in order to expect justice in Canada with respect to the infringements that we've seen and have been experiencing for the past 2 years, 2+ years in particular. I am a volunteer member with Lawyers for Truth. And Lawyers for Truth is a small group of lawyers and other professionals who have been trying to call out the tyranny in respect to the various healthcare measures that have been imposed upon us across Canada and the province of Alberta, and the infringement of our rights. And our main focus has been primarily on masking, and we became very vocal when the province implemented mandatory masking. And we believed at that time that if people were going to be able or willing to adopt a mask, a slave diaper, whatever you want to call it, put on their face, then we would be in big trouble. And I sit here today and I see that we are still in big trouble, notwithstanding the fact that we are allegedly out of, we're allowed to attend in public without a mask in most places, and that we, no longer have to get a vaccine to do certain things. However, as you have well known, or maybe you don't know, there are very many restrictions still alive and well in Canada and in the province of Alberta. We're still in stage 2 of this reopening plan, apparently. I don't know why we're not in stage 3 or why they haven't ended, but I suspect that the reason why we're still in stage 2 is because they have a plan to keep us in these stages and potentially in another lockdown, or worse, who knows. We also, for people who decide not to disclose their private healthcare information, as you know, we are not allowed to travel within Canada or leave the country of Canada, and by plane, train, or boat. And this is, of course, a problem. And Canada has, been dubbed, an open-air prison, biggest open-air prison in the world. Anyway, I'm not here to go on and on and on about that, but I do want to discuss with you why I still believe that the courts are not going to provide us the relief that we need to help end the tyranny in Canada and in Alberta that we are witnessing at this time. You all may be familiar with a court case that I initiated last July. I brought a charter challenge against the Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta and the Provincial Court of Alberta with respect to their masking laws or rules or whatever you want to call it. I refuse to disclose my private healthcare information, although you can probably guess where I stand on that and what my status probably is. In any event, I refuse to disclose it, and although the lovely lawyers of the Court of Queen's Bench invited me to file a human rights complaint against the courts, I didn't think that was going to get me very far, and so I initiated a charter challenge against the courts, and I have James Kitchen representing me. And you may all be familiar with James Kitchen's work. He's a constitutional lawyer, and he's been fighting very tirelessly for our rights and freedoms. Now, I wanted to give you a brief update with respect to that. We have filed all of our evidence. We have some really great experts that have been gracious enough to provide their evidence for us. So we've filed all of our evidence, and we're now at the stage where we are waiting to set a hearing. We are not too sure yet if the courts are going to want to cross-examine any of the witnesses and the experts. However, we are still just now waiting for a time for this matter to be heard by way of originating application. There's a problem with this whole scenario, though, that I think that needs to be made clear for people. I'm suing the Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta and the Provincial Court of Alberta, and the courts, all of the courts in Alberta have a masking policy and a vaccination policy. They all show up when they attend in their mask, and even despite the fact that Alberta has removed its mandatory masking requirements in almost every public place except for transit and in certain healthcare scenarios, the courts in their infinite wisdom, and I don't know what based on, have decided to keep their policies in place. And so I still cannot attend any courtroom or any courthouse in the province of Alberta without having to wear a mask. And I feel that There is an inherent bias in the courts because of the fact that they have these policies that they, in their infinite wisdom, have continued, like I said, notwithstanding the government relaxing this requirement. The other issue that is of great concern to me is that this case will be probably heard by another Court of Queen's Bench judge. So you can imagine, even if a Court of Appeal justice were to hear this case in Alberta, the fact that all three levels of court have adopted a policy of discrimination and infringing on people's rights and freedoms, the likelihood that I'm going to be successful in this case is very slim. So some might say, well, perhaps the best court to hear this would be the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, I don't think it's going to work out that way. And as we've heard at other APP events, and as Dr. Modry eloquently states, the likelihood that we are going to get a positive result in favor of human rights and freedoms on this issue, on healthcare, on the COVID issue, or on the trucker convoy issue is going to be very slim. And similarly, that kind of analysis extends to the courts assisting us with any attempt by Alberta to achieve a fair deal or anything like that within Confederation. In April of this year, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada was interviewed by a French publication called Le Devoir. And in the article, the Honorable Richard Wagner, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, said this about the trucker convoy. What we have seen recently on Wellington Street here is the beginning of anarchy, where some people have decided to take other citizens hostage, to take the law into their own hands, not to respect the mechanism. That I find worrying. Forced blows against the state, justice, and democratic institutions like the one delivered by protesters to the doors of the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council, Parliament, the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Press Gallery parliamentary between January 28th and February 21st, the time that the truckers were in Ottawa, must be denounced with force, and this by all the figures of power in the country, believes Mr. Wagner. He therefore, the article went on to state, he therefore disapproves of the political actors who stuck to the Freedom Convoy, which is made up of people of good faith, but also of remotely guided people seeking to bypass the political system. It doesn't inspire good feelings in me, and I find that disturbing, he says. So clearing up the confusion, he stated, the occupation of downtown Ottawa was fueled not only on diesel fuel, but also on a misunderstanding, and it must be said, a certain ignorance of the basics of the rule of law of Canada, laments Mr. Wagner. So I don't know about you, but it's clear that the Supreme Court Justice has a point of view about the trucker convoy. And it's clear that the courts who have policies that are discriminatory and violate human rights and freedoms have an opinion. And they proudly display it when they wear their masks wherever they go. So a group of lawyers in Canada, 13 of us to be specific, filed a complaint with the Canadian Judicial Council last week, or I believe it was last week, because it's our opinion that the Chief Justice's comments, there's a reasonable apprehension of bias that can be drawn from the comments that he's made. The Supreme Court of Canada has yet to hear any case related to the infringement of our rights and freedoms since COVID began just over 2 years ago. And so it's very well is going to be that the Supreme Court will, in fact, at some point hear a case that has made its way through the court system in whatever province, through the Court of Appeal and to the Supreme Court.
So when you have comments like this by the Chief Justice, who's said in other publications that he is proud of the fact that that the Supreme Court of Canada is the most progressive court in the world, and as Michael has already stated today, that notion of progressivism is not what it used to mean. It means something different, and is more woke in its interpretation and very, very leftist. There are huge problems that we're going to face potentially with finding justice at any level of courts in Canada, and specifically at the Supreme Court of Canada. And it is our recommendation to the Canadian Judicial Council that should any case make its way to the Supreme Court of Canada with respect to these issues in particular, that the Chief Justice himself recuse himself. Now, the Chief Justice Judicial Council of Canada is also made up of Chief Justices across every province in the country. So you can imagine that for whatever jurisdiction, whatever province that is continuing with these mandates themselves, or have seen fit to make decisions that are completely not in support of people's human rights and freedoms, we can reasonably conclude that the fact that justice is likely not to occur in Canada anytime soon. And that is why I'm in favor of an alternative solution rather than doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result that Michael's clearly and eloquently spoken about, and why attempts at reforming Alberta's position within Confederation remains to be challenging. At this point, we must come to a different solution. And for right now, the only peaceful solution that I can see actually working is to hold the referendum on independence to have the leverage necessary to negotiate the terms of our separation. If that doesn't work, I'm not too sure what the next steps will be. However, nothing changes if nothing changes. And voting for the same old is only going to get us the same old results. So you can see the problems that we have in the Canadian courts. I can tell you firsthand that the decisions in Canada have all been in favor of the government, and at a private level have favorably found in favor of government policies in support of the arguments that forced vaccination should occur with children, for instance, and that it is okay to fire an employee, for instance, for refusing to disclose private healthcare information or refusing to take a medical intervention that they don't agree with. There's one case in Ontario that did shed some light on this issue, and a brave judge there in a family law case was brave enough and courageous enough to discuss this issue, and even made some comments like, what is misinformation anyway? And really took to task the other decisions that we were seeing in different levels of court across Canada. But like I said, at this point, the likelihood that we're going to get any sort of positive result for this matter in Canada is going to be slim. As I mentioned, all the Chief Justices form part of the Canadian Judicial Council, and they are going to be deciding whether or not and what sort of penalty or sanction or whatnot that they might impose against the Chief Justice of Canada. And I'm not confident that they will actually do anything. The best possible case scenario will be that he'll recuse himself from hearing any of these matters. And again, the likelihood of that is probably slim to none. But I don't want to end on a bad note, even though I feel like our attempts will be, our arguments and whatnot, and the decisions will not fall in our favor. Now is the time for Albertans, especially, that we have to rise up, and we have to get involved, and we have to wake up and get involved in the process so that we can protect the future for our children. And it really is I was guilty of it too for most of my life as well, sitting by the sidelines thinking that people were acting in our best interest. But it's very clear that that's not the case. It's very clear that our political parties to date and many political parties and corporations that run our country and influence our policy are corrupt. And it's a bold statement to state that. I've been saying that for a number of years now, but it's true. And the more we look into it, the more we're finding that the depths of the corruption are something that go right to the core. And so when you have a situation like that, like I said, the only option I see us having is to vote for a party that believes in independence, is committed to holding a referendum, and is committed to bringing accountability back to Albertans in Canada, transparency, and not just paying lip service to those principles, but actually acting them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I did forget to mention that we have memberships. Memberships start at $20, and we have merchandise as well for sale. Also, Michael has his books on the back table. The books that I mentioned when I introduced him, they're $15, and they are a very good read. I recommend that. All right, moving right along. Our next guest attended the University of Alberta from 1985 to 1992, earning degrees with distinction in arts and law. He started his own law practice in northeastern Alberta in 1995 and has since grown into a firm of 12 lawyers in Cold Lake, Edmonton, and Calgary. That firm is now known as Grey, Woke, and Spencer, LLP, of which Leighton is the senior managing partner and head of its civil litigation section. He has received many awards and distinctions for his work on behalf of the First Nations people, and is a member of the Carry the Kettle Nation from Sintaluta, Saskatchewan. Since 2020, he has acted as lead counsel in several high-profile constitutional cases, including James Coates and Grace Life Church, Timothy Stevens and his church in Calgary, the lockdown challenge involving Dr. Dina Hinshaw, that is been being heard since February, and many vaccine mandate cases involving CN, CP, Alberta Health Services, the University of Winnipeg, University of Alberta, Mount Royal, Salvation Army, and etc. He is a proud Albertan, Canadian, conservative, and tireless advocate for restoration and rehabilitation of the civil liberties guaranteed to all of us by God and the rule of law, and enshrined under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leighton Grey.
Can I take that off?
Yeah.
I feel like I've got a magic show here with my lovely assistant. No, we're not going to saw you in half today. You're good. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm very pleased to be here. As you heard, I am a lawyer, constitutional lawyer. Also, more recently, a podcaster. Some of you might know me from recently a project that we started with my good friend Devin, who's off to my right. He's the star of the show, my producer, called Grey Matter. So I'm going to talk about some things that are maybe more optimistic. So, and I'm going to stay away from law a little bit. I'm going to come back to it. But I want to talk about the vision of APP as I understand it, and specifically about this concept of prosperity. But before I do that, I want to just say something, a shout out to my new and good friend, Michael Wagner. Michael was on my podcast. He was gracious enough to appear. Michael, this is a tablet. See, And if this blows out of my hand, we are all in really serious doo-doo. That you're getting one of these for Christmas, my friend, okay? But I'll warn you now, you have 11 children, you have to keep them away from it, or you'll never see them again. Okay. Oh, and I should also mention, you heard about the Ingram case I've been working on with my good friend Jeff Rath. Jeff Rath was in Airdrie speaking last weekend, and he got a standing ovation. I've heard about that standing ovation about 40 times since then. And just so you know, some of you may be disappointed that Jeff Rath isn't here. Jeff and I work together, and you know, we harass Denny Henshaw sometimes. But you know, Jeff, don't expect me to be that funny. Jeff, think of us like you know, Dumb and Dumber. Okay, he would be Jim Carrey. I'm the other guy. Okay, so let's talk about prosperity. Let's cue this up. So I talked with Dr. Modry about. Oh, wait a minute! Somebody got married. Congratulations! Dun, 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 dun. It's a little bit interesting that a wedding procession goes by when I'm basically talking about constitutional divorce. But, you know, life is like that sometimes. So I'm intrigued by this concept of prosperity. And I talked with Dr. Modry about this, and I discovered that this word was very deliberately chosen, and it's an aspirational word. And I know we talk a lot about the problems that are going on in Canada today, and we need to talk about them because we have to diagnose the problem. But we also have to talk about solutions. We have to talk about cures. We have to talk about a prognosis. Like, what can we do? And one of the great things about the APP, and one of the reasons why it appeals to me, is that it's boots on the ground. It's a constructional movement. You know, we're not just sort of crying in our beer. We're talking about what we can do positively. Michael talked a little bit about that in terms of the referendum and where that can go. If you want to learn more about that, I would encourage you to visit the APP website and also the Facebook page. I found just a wealth of information there. Okay, coming back to prosperity, I'm coming to my point. When you get paid money to talk, it's hard to stay on point. Okay, so this word prosperity. If you've seen my podcast, you know, I like quotations, aphorisms. So I'm going to give you a few about this concept of prosperity. Winston Churchill, who is, if you've watched my program, is a favorite of mine. He should be a favorite of yours because he might be one of the most important people of the 20th century. We might not be standing here if it weren't for him. He once said this. He said, "We contend that for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket and trying to lift himself up by the handle. I would contend that that man pulling on the handle is an Albertan." Next, in prosperity, this is Marcus Tullius Cicero. In prosperity, let us most carefully avoid pride, disdain, and arrogance. Wow, pride, disdain, and arrogance. Does that sound like anybody we know? Initials JT. I like this next one. Prosperity is not just having things, it is the consciousness that attracts the things. Prosperity is a way of living and thinking, not just having money or things. Okay, and its opposite is poverty. Shakespeare said, prosperity is the very bond of love, including, I would say, love of country, love of province, love of home, love of family, even love of self, the good kind. Shakespeare also said, kill all the lawyers, but we'll forgive that. Here's some synonyms for prosperity, just to give you a sense of how important this word is in the APP. Accomplishment, benefit, boom. Wow, there's Alberta right there. Boom, right? Expansion, growth, riches, success, wealth, welfare, not the kind Trudeau wants, okay? Welfare means, you know, a state of being where you're healthy. Well-being, abundance, advantage, like Remember Ralph Bucks? Those of you who are old enough, the Alberta Advantage. To do something, right? To be fortunate, to give increase, to be fruitful and multiply. So this word prosperity is more than it's more than just a word there. This prosperity has been, I think, very carefully chosen, and it gives a very positive vision. It's very important. In fact, speaking of vision, if you go and you take a look at the Alberta Prosperity Project vision, all this information is there for you to see. It's a 10-point vision. And I would say that this idea of prosperity really unites the full 10-point vision, because in the 10 points, it talks about things like this. Alberta becomes the most free and prosperous nation in the world to live, work, raise a family, and start a business. That sounds good. First Nations participate as founding partners. That sounds really good to me. No Albertan is left behind. There's no need for political left or right. How good does that sound? Who else is sick of hearing about the left and the right? You know, when I was a hockey player before, the only left and right was, which way you shot. Now this is all we talk about in public discourse, left and right. Workers' rights are protected and business is allowed to thrive, okay? Without COVID restrictions and horrible taxes and property taxes driving small business owners out of business while big box stores and Amazon flourish. How about social programs are compassionate and effective? Okay. Healthcare and education are of the highest quality. Pensions and old age security for our seniors. Every Albertan and their family enjoy an enhanced quality of life and standard of living. Alberta becomes the lowest tax and highest GDP per capita nation in the world. Imagine that. Alberta would be the richest country in the world. Just stop and drink that in for a second. Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because when we talk about separation, people ask me about, and I told them that I'm getting involved in APP. By the way, I'm a newbie to this. This is only my second meeting. These people were crazy enough to let me get up here and talk, okay? This is my first time being here, and I'm grateful to be here. But, I have to confess, I was a little shy of APP because I was raised in the Peter Lougheed era, where we were Canadians first, we were Albertans second. And part of being a good Albertan was being a good Canadian. And as Michael has so eloquently explained, both here and on my podcast, as another plug, that hasn't worked. And so one of the reasons why I stayed away from the APP, or I was shy of it, is this word separatist. Because I'm old enough to remember separatism as, René Lévesque, the cigarette chomping guy who wouldn't sign the Constitution, right? And separatism, it has a bad connotation. The APP is different because the separatism is a means to prosperity. More than a means, it's a necessity. It's a natural step. It's a growth phase, part of the metamorphosis, okay? It's like, I don't know, Alberta coming out of the cocoon. We could be that butterfly. We could be that richest country in the world, but we can't do it when we're trapped in the cocoon. And that's where we've been for these many years. So, but there's another context around prosperity that I want to talk about, and the reason why the APP speaks to me. Because I'm a conservative, small c conservative. And I read a book, actually several books, by an author that you should check out. His name's Dr. Roger Scruton. I'm sure Michael knows who I'm talking about. And sadly, he died far too soon, about 5 years ago in 2017. He was in his early 70s. But fortunately for us, he left us behind him just a legacy of the most wonderful books. He's also, he spoke a lot publicly. So if you go onto YouTube, you can hear a number of his speeches and interviews. Just a beautifully eloquent, Cambridge-educated lawyer. But more than that, he was schooled, educated in things like architecture. He was even an authority on wines, if you can believe it. Anyway, he wrote a wonderful book called How to Be a Conservative. And we use this word all the time, conservative, and we don't know what it means. And when I read that book, I understood what it means. And then when I connected, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try to connect two dots for you about Roger Scruton's concept of conservatism and what that means, and prosperity within the context of APP. So hopefully I won't, if I lose you, it's because I didn't do a good job of explaining this, because I always assume, and Devin's here, our assumption on the podcast, all the people who are listening are intelligent. And they're also there because they want to be engaged in a meaningful conversation. So this is what I'm trying to have with you right now. So what is the connection between prosperity and conservatism? Well, there is one, and it's beauty. Let me explain. So Dr. Roger Scruton defined what a conservative is in the best way that I have found. And this is what he said. What does a conservative do? When you want to know what something is, right, you ask what it does. Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do, right? So if you steal all the time, you're a thief. You lie all the time, you're a prime minister. I mean, you're a liar. But my point is, we are what we repeatedly do, okay? So what does a conservative do? First principles, a conservative conserves. Okay, well, that's a start, but it's not an answer. It's the beginning of an answer. So as a conservative, what do we conserve? Well, Dr. Roger Scruton says we preserve beauty. Okay, so we're getting closer to the answer. Well, what is beauty? Is beauty, we hear that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, maybe that's true. I'm not so sure that many people, I could get on board with people saying that the state of Canada today is beautiful. I would say tragically beautiful, maybe beautiful in a macabre sense, where we're in a black comedy. But what is really beautiful and what is worth conserving, this is what Dr. Roger Scruton said, are all the things that we value, that we hold dear, that we would want to preserve, that we would want to fight for, that we would die for, to pass on to our children and their children and their children and their children. Okay, so that's beauty. So think about all the things that would include. That would include, if you're a hockey fan, that would include the Oilers. If you love the opera, that would include the Marriage of Figaro. Okay? All the things that you consider beautiful, the things that you would pass on, the legacy of Alberta, of all of this is beautiful. When we talk about the environment, what are we talking about? Conservation, right? We want the trees and the clean water and everything for our kids and for our grandchildren. That's beauty. We want to conserve that. And guess what? That's in the APP plan too. And all of this is part of prosperity. Another old guy that Michael will know about is named Socrates. He talked about beauty in terms of forms, okay? So, for example, this microphone, Socrates would say that this is an approximation of a form, okay? The beautiful microphone, the ideal microphone, which doesn't exist, existed in someone's head, and they created this thing. To the extent that this microphone is beautiful, okay, it approximates the form of the microphone. So how does this relate to what I'm talking about? Well, the APP, the vision, as I see it, is a form. That vision that I just read to you, that's the form of beauty, of a beautiful, sovereign, free, prosperous nation. Okay? That's a form. And right now, it exists as an idea. So the job that we have right now as Albertans is to take that idea, approximate that form, speak and walk and act that vision into reality. And when we do that, we will have a beautiful, free, and prosperous Alberta. Okay? So that's what I see the vision of the APP and what we're trying to do here. So yes, it's about separatism, but it's the kind of separatism that happens when you have a leg that's full of gangrene and it has to come off to save the body. Only guess what? Imagine if that occurred, but you were like some sort of amphibious life form that could grow that leg back, and it would be 10 times as strong as it was before, right? Okay, so this is where I'm going to end off. I've been asked, I'm very honored, Dr. Modry asked me to work on the new Constitution. for the new Alberta. How great is that? Honestly, what an honor. And within that, I'm going to be constructing a new Bill of Rights. So I'm going to tell you just as a preview what the first two statements in the Bill of Rights are going to be. Number one, we affirm and acknowledge the supremacy of God and the rule of law. That's number one. Number two, no government, legislature, or court shall restrict, infringe, violate, or limit an individually protected freedom set out in this Bill of Rights. So we will never again have a situation where Dr. Hinshaw or anybody else is telling us, you don't have rights, you have privileges. We're going to hand these out like Halloween candy. And oh, by the way, well, maybe we'll cancel Halloween this year. No more. The individual is supreme in the new Alberta. And that is the way, that's the only way to a prosperous Alberta and sovereign Alberta that's free. So I encourage all of you to find out more about the APP. And I want to thank you for your attention today. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to be here.
Thank you, Leighton. I'm going to invite Katherine and Michael and Leighton to join me on the stage. We do have a few questions. You guys were listening. Thank you very much for that. We'll just get you to hold that for me and I'll set up everything.
Yeah.
Okay, let's give this a go. I'm not sure which one of you will answer which questions, but you all have an opportunity. Okay?
Where are the buzzers?
There's no buzzers. Unless somebody comes up here and tackles you off the stage, you're okay. And it's usually me that threatens that. How will a new Alberta prosper being landlocked?
You want me to answer that one because I talked about prosperity? Okay. Well, I'm going to give you Tanner 90's explanation. And he gives a very good one. And if you want a better explanation than I'm going to give, I would encourage you to go back and watch some of the previous Facebook presentations. But essentially, it's this. He says that it would not be in Canada's or Alberta's interest to have a landlocked Alberta. And it basically is fundamentally impractical. If you think about it, for example, Vancouver is one of the largest and busiest seaports in the world. It's the gateway to China. And the problem is before, all those handguns can get from China to Ottawa so Trudeau can hand them out to his police, they have to pass through Alberta. So that's just one of the problems, right? But fundamentally, and Michael could probably speak to this too, fundamentally it just would not make any sense. And this is another point about separatism. And again, why I'm a big fan of the APP vision is that it doesn't imagine a confrontational relationship with Ottawa the way that Quebec has mapped it out. It envisions instead, a friendly, amicable relationship between sovereign nations, much like we've had for a very long time with the United States and Great Britain. You want to add anything, Michael?
I'd like to add something. I do like that answer and agree with it. However, wouldn't you all agree that we're already mostly landlocked? Policy locked. Thanks, Shannon. It's policy, but I'm kind of locked in this province too, unless I decide to get into my trusty little car and drive across the province. That's as far as I can go. So I think I think we're a country, a province filled with very intelligent people. And I think that we will find a way. And also, I also believe that Alberta has enough resources to create its own wealth and prosperity and to take care of its own citizens right here and right now.
Actually, I really don't have much to say to that, but just to emphasize that it's not in Canada's interest to try and harm Alberta. If Alberta moves toward independence, for Canada to try and shut us off and shut us in, that would actually hurt them economically as well. It's in their economic best interest and political best interest not to try and punish Alberta for becoming independent. That would hurt them. Like, that would reduce their economic prosperity as well. So I don't think they're going to hurt themselves just to spite us. It's not really a rational thing to do. So as Leighton mentioned, it makes sense. It just makes sense that they would want to have policies would benefit an independent Alberta along with Canada in terms of, you know, reasonable trade and those kinds of policies.
The next question has to do with our policies, and I just need to mention that on the back table we have the Alberta Prosperity Project Indigenous policies. We printed out several copies just because of where we are today. So we'll have they're on the back table, and you can come and grab one if you want. Would a new Alberta support or rebuild the present healthcare and education systems? Okay, so the Alberta Prosperity Project has in their policies and governance that is available on our website a clear and concise plan for both healthcare and education, as well as policing and the justice system and all of those things. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I do invite you to go to the website, albertaprosperity.com, and scroll down to those particular policies and give them a read. They're very well written, and constitutional lawyers and the Alberta Prosperity Project team, they have a plan in place for all of the things that Alberta will need when she is an independent sovereign nation. And I don't know who asked this question, but I'm going to find you.
Just as an adjunct to that, I can comment a lot about what's wrong with the current healthcare system. And I spent many hours studying this, going through thousands and thousands of pages, preparing for, the Ingram case and dealing with the government of Alberta and their witnesses who tried to justify all the COVID measures. And when you start looking at the policy behind our healthcare, what you find are things like social justice and health equity, which is doublespeak for socialism. So if you want to understand what's going on, why our healthcare systems and education systems are failing, again, you go back to Sir Winston Churchill, who said that socialism is the ideology of failure. But wherever you have socialism and where it takes root, it becomes your guiding philosophy. You have waste of resources, you have corruption, you have indoctrination, where people are not making proper decisions that are rational and that are in the best interests of the public, and they become corrupted in the sense that they will worry about justifying their own existence and looking after their own groups, their own cliques, as opposed to applying resources in a way that's going to educate people and also take care of them. So when you look at the healthcare system and the education system, fundamentally, when you go down, you look at the foundations of them, it's rotted wood, and it's got to be put away. And we have to have a system that is focused upon, again, achieving prosperity for children, prosperity for families, prosperity for elderly, including health, including education.
And just to clarify, if you do go on the website and you're looking at the policies and you feel like you have a question, you can send it to contact@albertaprosperity.com, and it will get rerouted to the right person. It will probably come to me, and then it will go to somebody else. So that's the best way if you find a question from one of the policies on the website. I'm looking for clarity. For a party to be considered an independence party, they must have a commitment in asking Albertans the referendum question on independence within a certain timeline and written in their policy. Is that a fair statement?
I'll take that. I do believe that that's a fair statement, because based on my research, and what I've been hearing in these political movements, is that for years there's been an intention for parties and a claim that they're independent. However, for various reasons, upon getting elected, they really do nothing about it. And so I think it is important that Albertans know right off the giddy up exactly what the party they're voting for intends to do, and that there's a timeline proposed that you can hold the government to account to. So I do believe that there are independence parties that are masquerading as independence parties that maybe are not independence parties, because they're not willing to commit to hold a referendum within a certain period of time.
Well, I'm just going to add this, and Michael will correct me if this is wrong. I think it's significant that the APP has made a pledge that it's not only is it not a political party, it's never going to be. And so this concept of leverage is really important. So I think it's wrong-headed to think of the APP in terms of an independence party. I think that's selling it really short. What Dr. Modry and the leadership of the APP talks about instead is this concept of leverage, and that's why we're here today. We're in the phase of educational phase, getting information out to people so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not they could support the APP. That is where we're going to get leverage. When we get numbers, we get support, financial support, and then the idea is that leverage is going to position the APP so that they will have the ability to influence in the proper way Alberta elections. The idea being that ultimately no party is going to be elected in Alberta unless they sign on and they are prepared to take on the APP vision and, as I said, bring it into reality. So again, I just think you have to be careful about thinking about lumping APP in with some independent parties. If it were that, I wouldn't be sitting here.
So just to bring us back to the word leverage, we rebranded as the Alberta Prosperity Project on the 18th of February, and we are now, as of Friday, we were at over 5,200 members. So that is like 3 months plus 2 weeks. So what we are doing to try to create more memberships is we started chapters. We're starting chapters in every community of Alberta. What is that going to do for you? Well, that is a way that you can bring back community to your area. And we will provide you with the training. We will provide you with the material. We'll give you the rack cards. We'll give you the petitions. We have training online every week, a new topic every week. And so by doing that, we have created already 111 chapters. The majority of them are in the rural areas, but we do have some in Calgary and Edmonton. And we have one started in Red Deer. And we grew so quickly. By the end of March, we had 43 chapters. By the end of May, we are up to 111. So we are doing something right. Please explain how we will protect ourselves from being taken over by Canada or the United States.
I haven't had the question quite worded like that. I'm just trying to think about that. But I guess the main thing is, I mean, technically, we're already part of Canada. So first we have to become separate from Canada. And that is going to be through the referendum, where we have a clear question and a clear majority of people vote in favor of that. Now, once we've got the referendum successfully passed, the federal government is required by constitutional law to negotiate our independence. Now, some people say, well, what if they decide not to? Like, we've seen government apparently ignore constitutional law and ignore laws, so why wouldn't they ignore our result? And I guess I'm kind of spinning this question in the sense that that's how Canada could take us over, by ignoring a referendum result. First of all, I mean, there's a lot of hypothetical questions that people bring forward about why, what this could happen and that can happen. And it is true, like, we don't know the future. Hypothetically, Canada could try and do something to take us over or ignore a referendum result. But we can't know these hypothetical things. All we can know is the things we can know. We can know that the constitutional law is for us to hold a referendum with a clear question. We know that. So we move forward based on what we know, not on what could potentially happen. But that said, in a worst case scenario where we hold a successful referendum and a large majority have voted in favor and the Canadian government says, well, we're going to ignore that, I think actually that would in some sense play in our favor, because if a majority of Albertans vote in favor of something and the federal government says, well, we're going to ignore that anyway, the people who did not vote in favor of the independence will see what kind of country that they're really in. And I think that would wake people up. I think people in places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba and BC would say, wait a minute, we thought Canada was this country of laws, governed by law. But I mean, if the federal government decides to ignore constitutional law, we really don't have a country in any sense. I mean, the Constitution is the founding document of a country. If you don't have a constitution, you don't have a government, you don't have a country, really. So I don't see, like, when people bring up hypothetical situations where things could go bad for us, like I say, we don't know the future, we don't know what's going to happen, but I don't see how that's going to work against us if the federal government ignores a clear result in an election and ignores our constitutional law. That will wake up more people as to what this country is really all about, and I think that would actually supercharge our movement. That we already want independence, we already see what's wrong with Canada with what we know already, and for a government to ignore something so clear, to ignore the democratic result of a referendum, to do that clearly and in plain view of the entire world, that would wake up more people to what's wrong with this country. And so I think that would actually play in our favor in that sense, and waking up more people, not only within Canada, but to show people in other countries, and particularly the Americans. I don't think the United States is just going to ignore the Canadian government. Was not going to just let that go if the Canadian government was to ignore a clear result and a clear referendum, something in accordance with our constitutional law. Countries of the world would see what's going on. In the same sense, like someone mentioned, it would be kind of like Russia invading Ukraine, where so many countries are helping Ukraine and seeing that Ukraine, seeing the justice of the Ukrainian cause in terms of self-defense. And again, it'd be like Alberta. We've been in a situation of self-defense, defending ourselves against an aggressive government. So with a lot of these hypothetical situations about what could happen, I think some of them would play in our favor. And of course, theoretically, the Americans could take us over too. It's unlikely. The Americans did take over some land, I guess, in the 1800s violently, but they haven't done that for many generations. And I think I don't see the Americans right now, and I don't think that there would be support in the United States itself for some kind of violent takeover like that. I mean, it would be different if Albertans voted in a referendum in favor of joining the United States, but that's not the referendum we're talking about. So I don't think the Americans would just walk in and try and take us over, because I don't think there's that kind of sentiment in the United States for taking taking territories militarily like that. So I hope that's getting close to answering the question. Is that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Once we gain independence, how do we get rid of the corruption both in the legislature and the bureaucracy? For example, the assistant deputy ministers.
Well, I think this is the part that I was talking about, where we have to have a new constitution. So, and I would use the word renovate. Renovate means to make new, and that's really what we're talking about here. And so with the new constitution and new Bill of Rights, we'd be starting from scratch. Okay, so it would give us the opportunity to keep the parts of the past that we consider beautiful. Maybe that means that's the Queen. Maybe it means that we're going to have new political parties. We may pass laws that prohibit the formation of political parties. It seems to me, and some of you might agree, that the political party system is not working very well for Canadians at the moment. Just looking at the federal alliance between the Liberals and the NDP, we have a prime minister that received, I think, something like 31% in the last election, but he's consolidated power until 2025 through an alliance between parties and people voting along party lines. There was a vote last week to do away with the travel mandates, and they all voted along party lines. It was defeated 202 to 117. Well, in a legislature with no parties, that vote might look very, very different. So that's the whole point of the APP, is it's a new start. It's a brand new start. And so we'd have to look at all those things. We keep what was good, improve what was worth improving, and do away with all the rest.
Further to that, Leighton, and I do agree with you. I think in the short term, though, I think what Albertans need to be considering is that, and acknowledging that it's become abundantly obvious, or at least to myself, and I think to many of you listening, that it's the bureaucracy that runs this government in Alberta and across Canada. And this government is made up of the deputy ministers, the assistant deputy ministers, et cetera, upper management and institutions such as AHS, whatnot. So I think when you're considering what to do in the next election, if it were me, I would fire these people. Because we have to at some point take a stand immediately. And while I do, and I'm in favor of holding the referendum question imminently upon forming government, or a new government, or having any government ask that question, it's going to take some time. And in the meantime, we have to live in this circus that is upon us right now. And so I think that any government or any elected official who thinks that they're going to fix the system using, with sweet talking or anything like that, is probably fooling themselves. And so I think what you should be looking for in the next election is a party in the meantime that is willing to be to be a party of accountability. And I think that what you're going to be seeing unfolding over this next year are a lot of buzzwords. And I invite Albertans to look behind the integrity behind and the words behind the buzzwords, and whether to date any of those promises by the parties to date have actually been fulfilled.
Will previous First Nations treaties be honored in a new Alberta?
Okay, that's a good question. But before we get there, let's talk about what the relationship between First Nations and Canada looks like right now. Not far from here is Masquachese First Nation, formerly known as Hobima. Many of you have probably been there. You know what that looks like, okay? It's an embarrassment. We should be ashamed of that. First Nations people should not want that. They don't, okay? Here's what else the relationship between Canada and First Nations looks like. The other night, it was discovered that our Prime Minister had holed himself up in the Palliser Hotel in Calgary. Nobody knew why. It leaked out. People showed up there. And a day later, we found out that he went there to deliver a check. $1.3 billion check to Siksika. That is a dysfunctional relationship. That's a relationship of dependency. The relationship between First Nations and Canada has been one of dependency from the very beginning. It was designed that way, and it will be that way for as long as things are done the way they are. So coming back to the question, what the APP would do, as I understand it, is the APP would do, the new Alberta would do what Canada has never done, and that is actually sit down and have a consultation with First Nations and design a relationship that is in everyone's best interests. It may be that some of the First Nations will want to remain part of Canada. That's a possibility. I hope that's not true. I would think that the people I know, First Nations people, are much smarter than that, and they value freedom. They value prosperity. They value all the things that you do. And I would think they would want to be part of a new Alberta. But the point is, there would be a seat at the table, and they would be fully consulted. They will be partners in the new nation, sovereign nation of Alberta, and no longer subjugated, no longer waiting for handouts, even $1.3 billion ones.
In a new Alberta, how will we know that once elected that we won't just go back to the way it is now?
That's a great question. Going back to about 250 years ago, when the American founding fathers got together, they were doing a lot of what we're talking about right now. They didn't know what that was going to look like. For the first time, they were designing a new republic. It was all brand new, and they didn't know. And in fact, they designed their constitution in large degree to prevent exactly what you just said, because in fact, this happened in France. France between 1789 and 1799 went from having a king to having a revolution, killing a bunch of people, and then they ended up with an emperor. So from a king to an emperor in 10 years. So that could happen. But the way that is prevented is through the vision, acting out the vision, and through ensuring that there are constitutional protections that are there. So is it possible that could happen? Yes, there's always a possibility of corruption, but the best way to prevent corruption is to begin with ideas that are incorruptible.
Just further to that, I know that APP does have on their website policies that do address this, including the proposal of robust recall legislation, for instance, and other mechanisms to hold elected officials accountable.
I just wanted to add, like, the constitutional question is very significant. Like, the Constitution makes a huge difference in terms of the country's politics. But the other thing is the citizens. Like, it's very important that the citizens pay attention and select leaders that are good leaders. Like, there's a saying that you get the leaders you deserve. Like, people, you end up voting for the people you deserve. You get the elected representatives you deserve, because Trudeau was elected, right? He wasn't put in power by somebody else. I mean, he wasn't elected by us. He was elected by people in Toronto and Montreal. We have to keep in mind that in any democracy, fundamentally the power is with the people who select the leadership. And so if people are not selecting good leaders, we won't end up with good leaders. So the Constitution, sets up the government and the limitations of its powers, and that's essential. But also the other essential thing is the people. If you have people who are not interested, or people who don't care, or people who themselves are corrupted, they will get the kind of leaders they deserve. And so it's very important for the voting public themselves to be good people and to pay attention to the kind of people that they're putting into power, because ultimately it's the voters that put the people into power that we have. Our leaders are there because they were put into power by voters and not by somebody else, right? So I just wanted to make the point of how important it is for the voters themselves, the people with the actual power, to choose the right kind of leaders.
Will a new Alberta be part of the United Nations?
Well, there are pros and cons to that. If anybody's been following the UN, there may be very good reasons why a new and sovereign Alberta would not want to be part of the UN. I don't think, in my respectful view, I don't think the UN is serving their member nations very well. I don't think that if the UN were functioning properly, that they would permit, for example, China to be a member. Certainly not have a seat at the table on the human rights committees. I mean, it's absurd. So there are very good reasons, and this is one of the great things about forming a new nation that is sovereign, is we could make decisions about what peace treaties, what international accords that we could sign on to, and we could be wise and sagacious about that, as opposed to just signing on and virtue signaling with outfits like the UN and the World Economic Forum. So yes, I would think, if I were being asked, if I were a legal advisor to the leader of the new Alberta, I'd be saying, yes, well, we could look at UN membership, but let's determine whether or not we're going to do that on the basis of our vision, and whether that is going to be best for Alberta and Albertans. And if it's not, then we don't join.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Leighton said. Like, there's kind of two sides to the United Nations. There's a kind you see publicly a lot where they're giving money to refugees and helping refugees, and that's a good thing. It's good to have an agency that helps refugees and people in trouble. But there's another side to the United Nations. The United Nations, has a political agenda of its own, and it's not a political agenda that I think is a good agenda. And so it would definitely be like if it was a matter of if we were going to vote here on whether Alberta would be part of the United Nations, I'd vote against that myself. I mean, like I say, they do some good things. They've helped some people, but the political agenda of the United Nations, the political agenda that I have seen, is not one that I support. Well, actually, can I just add something that's actually not related to this? Katherine talked about the court case against Chief Justice Richard Wagner. I just want to make it. Complaint. I just want to make clear that Richard Wagner, I'm not related to him, even though I have the same last name.
Remember when we started, I mentioned Thomas Jefferson and how he says, whenever you do a thing, do that thing as if the whole world is watching. The Alberta Prosperity Project has been doing that thing as if the whole world has been watching. We've been traveling across Alberta from community to community with guest speakers such as these three on our stage today. And they have been planting the seeds of hope and the seeds of change. And in their presentations, they have solutions, they have ideas. And when they come up here and present those to you, we hope that you take those back to your friends and your families, to your communities, and help spread that message. We've got one chance to save something for our children and our grandchildren. We've got one chance to secure our freedom and our prosperity, and that is by electing an independent-minded government in 2023. Your legacies depend on that. How are we going to do that? Pardon me. We need you to buy memberships. That's how we keep rolling across the province. We need you to buy merchandise. Again, that's how we keep rolling across the province. It also helps us to advertise what the Alberta Prosperity Project is. If you're walking down the street with your Alberta Prosperity Project hat or t-shirt on, somebody's going to ask you about that. And we appreciate when you talk about it. When we get up here and you might think of one thing. All we're doing is planting those seeds of change, and we need you to be the change that you want to see in the world. We're rebuilding the communities that have been so broken by our governments, and we want you to be part of the community. And Alberta will become an independent, sovereign nation, one where First Nations people sit at the table as equal partners in solutions for a new Alberta. And on that day, Alberta truly will become united, strong, and free. Let's hear it for our presenters today. Thank you for coming out. You guys can go now. You're dismissed. Yeah, sorry.
Can I give you this?
I'll take it. Maybe will I take